Um, so it's not directly connected to the parasha, although in my introduction, I made a kind of what you'll see is a forced connection, how there are things that our patriarchs and matriarchs did that are later forbidden by the Torah. And in a way, you can say it's not a problem because it was before the Torah was given. But there is also a midrashic tradition that the patriarchs observed all the mitzvot. There is some tension between those two different claims. But um, so on Thursday night, we were having dinner, obviously Thanksgiving dinner, and one of the people there asked me about if bugs are kosher, and um, if you follow some of the developments in new types of food and so on and so forth, scientists and ecologists are saying that bugs are going to become like more and more common of a food because they provide a lot of protein for not a lot of cost and not a lot of, it's certainly less resources to grow an equivalent amount of protein from bugs than, let's say, from a cow. But bugs in general are not kosher. However, there are certain types of locusts and crickets and grasshoppers, which the Torah does tell us are kosher, right? The question is, how do we know? How do we know? My workspace is in a basement, okay? I share it with crickets. Fortunately, not too frequently, but how would I know if a particular cricket is kosher or not, right? And the answer is I can't, I don't, and therefore it is assumed to be not kosher, right? So the question is, but we do know that there are kosher species of these crickets and locusts and grasshoppers. How do you know if a particular grasshopper is kosher or not kosher? Anybody have any idea?
I really don't know, but I just want to point out if it's named Jiminy, it isn't.
Okay. Anyone else?
Let's say the color.
The color. Okay. So let me introduce you to a word and a concept. Okay. Masora, right? Masora means tradition, right? Like the conservative movement in Israel and increasingly throughout the world is known as Masorti. Okay, the Masora means tradition, but it comes from the root limsor, which is to hand over or to transmit. Okay, so a Masora is a specific tradition of your family or your community, right? So if you have a Masora that allows you to determine, to distinguish kosher crickets from non-kosher crickets, you can eat those kosher crickets. Okay. The only extant Jewish community that has a Masorah that enables them to identify kosher crickets and grasshoppers is the Yemenites. Okay, so if you have a Yemenite friend who learned from his father or grandfather how to distinguish kosher crickets, and he says, here, have some crickets, they're kosher, you can have them. Okay, but you can't become part of the Masorah, but you can partake in them if you are with somebody from a community that has a Masorah. Okay, I mean, unfortunately, I would, because in Mexico, grasshopper tacos are, I mean, sorry, cricket tacos, chapulines, are popular, and they're supposedly very good, but you know, Gornish Telfin, right? We don't have a Masorah to determine the crickets, but there actually are, like, there's an institute in Jerusalem. Every once in a while, they will have what they call a Masorah dinner to help keep and perpetuate that Masorah so that certain kosher foods don't get lost. Right now, you may be saying at this point, well, Rabbi, this is moderately interesting, right? But I have no desire to eat crickets or grasshoppers. So, what is the point of this, and what is the relevance to my life? Right. So, let me ask another question. Who here had turkey for dinner on Thanksgiving? Okay. How do you know that turkey is kosher? Gail.
Well, since birds are identified by being kosher by being listed, the turkey wasn't listed, but eventually they made a mistake somewhere along the line, and somebody decided turkey was in fact kosher, and now we've decided that turkey is kosher, but it wasn't originally one of the listed birds.
Correct, right? I mean, you said in one sentence what I'm going to say in 20 minutes, right? But I'm going to explore it more deeply, right? I mean, the quick answer is, right? I went to Costco, I went to Trader Joe's, I went to Modi's, I went to Shalom's, and I bought a turkey and it says OU on it. Not only does it say OU, it says OU glot, okay, which is completely absurd because there is no such thing as glot poultry, because glot means the lungs have been inspected and found to be smooth, and nobody is inspecting turkey lungs. But people now expect glot, which means not only kosher, but like very kosher or super, right? Or kosher enough that even my Zadie and Bubby would have eaten, right? So they label all kinds of things as glot, which are not actually glot, right? But Gail's point is exactly correct, right? That, um, I mean, how do we know? Like, if we discover, let's say, a new mammal that had not been known before, right? Somebody is exploring, I don't know, in the Australian outback, and they come across this new mammal that, you know, I want to say nobody, but no Jews have ever seen this mammal before, right? The only people who have known of this mammal are the indigenous Australians, right? How can we tell if this mammal is kosher? Yeah, yeah.
It's got a cloven hoof and it chews its cud.
Cloven hoof chews the cud, kosher, right? So like giraffes are kosher, right? And I don't know anybody's ever eaten giraffe, but in theory, if you went and bought yourself a giraffe and hired a shochet, and got a ladder for the shochet, or maybe a bucket truck, and the shochet could chef your giraffe, and giraffe burgers for dinner, right? Because we have simanim, we have signs that tell us whether a mammal is kosher. Cloven hoof and chew the cud. And fish, very easy to tell if a fish is kosher, right? Fins and scales. If it has fins and scales, it's kosher. If it doesn't have fins and scales, it's not kosher. I mean, there's an argument about how do we exactly define scales, right? Which is why some people eat swordfish and some people don't eat swordfish. Some people eat sturgeon and some people don't eat sturgeon, because the question is whether what swordfish and sturgeon have are scales or not scales. But, you know, bracketing that question, right? If a fish has fins and scales, it's kosher. If not, not, right? But as Gail correctly said, right, for birds, we have a list in the Torah of birds which are kosher and a list which are not kosher. And, many of them are no longer identifiable, right? We have this whole list of birds, and, we think we know what they are, but we're not 100% sure, right? So the way that we know a bird is kosher or not is Masorah, right? Just like the Yemenites have a Masorah about which grasshoppers and locusts are kosher and which are not, right? Different communities have a Masorah about whether a particular bird is kosher or not, right? Although all kosher birds have certain characteristics in common, that kosher species have an extra toe, a crop, and a gizzard which can be peeled. And conversely, birds of prey are not kosher, right? But generally that's not enough. If you find a bird that meets all the characteristics of a kosher bird, but there's no Masorah that it's kosher, then it can't be kosher, right? Now, if you come across a bird that's a bird of prey, you know for sure it's not kosher, right? But it's always easier to declare something not kosher than kosher, right? So the problem with is Turkey is a new world bird, right? It is native to the Americas. Specifically, it originates. Well, there's two different types of wild turkey, and one of them originates in the Mexican mainland, and the other in the Yucatan and Guatemala. And since there were no Jews, I mean, contrary to to what the Mormons think, there were no Jews in the Americas prior to 1492. Then there cannot possibly have been a Masorah about the turkey being a kosher bird, right? Because it was not known by any Jewish community that they could have a Masorah about it, right? So, if that is the case, how could the turkey be considered a kosher bird, right? I mean, Gail, you said something along, they made a mistake and they accept, right? But what precisely was the mistake that was made? Right? Well, there are two different ones as far as I can tell. One is the idea that the turkey is basically a big chicken. It's a species of chicken. And since, right, I mean, nobody disagrees that chicken is kosher. And if a turkey is a big chicken, then it's kosher too, right? And there is a halachic, what's known as the hybridization test, right? Like if a certain mammal that we don't know whether it's kosher or bird, right, can breed with a mammal or a bird that we do know is kosher, right? The belief in the Talmud is that kosher and non-kosher animals can't interbreed, right? So if you could hybridize a chicken and a turkey, right, then we know that the turkey is kosher, right? That would be excellent, except that chickens and turkeys cannot breed with each other, right? So the hybridization test failed, right? So, all right, so let me throw this out, right? Why do we call a turkey a turkey? Why do we call a turkey a turkey? Anybody know? Take a guess. Why do we call a turkey a turkey?
They thought it came from Turkey.
They thought it came from Turkey. Right, exactly. Right? I mean, for whatever reason, now, of course, when it's really known only as a turkey in English and a couple of other languages, and in English at the time, Turkey did not necessarily mean the country we now know as Turkey, right? Um, uh, Turkey meant all those exotic Muslim countries over there in the East, okay? Not necessarily the country governed by Viktor Orban. Um, and but they thought it came from the exotic Muslim countries in the East, right? Whereas in certain other languages, like Gail, you, I think, know French, right? How do you say turkey, not the country, the bird, right? In French. Does anybody know? Anybody speak French? I don't speak French, okay? But turkey, what? Turkey in French is spelled Dinde, which means from India, right? And in Yiddish, it's called a Hindiker hen, right? Which means an Indian hen. And and in Hebrew, I mean, we say Hodu, which means India. It's actually called Tarnagol Hodu, which means an India rooster, right? Because people believed it came from India. Okay, now India and Turkey, in terms of the way people thought 500, 550 years ago, are not necessarily two different places, right? Because Turkey meant those exotic countries to the east, and one of those exotic countries to the east was India, right? But the fact that in Hebrew and Yiddish it's called an Indian hen or an Indian rooster is actually relevant. Why? Because there are Jews in India, right? There are Jews in India. If you go to Israel, approximately 1% of the Jewish population of Israel, if you go to Israel, approximately 1% of the Jewish population of Israel are Indian Jews and their descendants. okay? And you can find beautiful, wonderful kosher fleishig Indian food in Israel because there's an Indian Jewish community, okay? And the belief was that the Indian Jewish community had a tradition that this was a kosher bird, okay? And since the Indian Jewish community had a tradition that this was a kosher bird, then that was fine, right? The only problem is the Indian Jewish community did not have a tradition that this was a kosher bird because it ain't from India, right? So there are all kinds of, right, essentially mistaken reason why Jews were considered why Jews, why turkeys were considered by Jews to be kosher, right? And um, it spread in Europe pretty rapidly. Apparently, there in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, there is a reference to the turkey bird, and Shakespeare assumed that people knew what this was. Um, and you know, so but for Jews, I mean, the idea that this came not from Turkey but from India, and the belief that there is a Masorah among the Indian Jewish community that this is a kosher bird was the basis for accepting it as kosher. Now, having said that, there are specific either families or communities that don't accept the turkey as kosher, right? And interestingly enough, I have a friend um, whose wife grew up Hasidic. Okay, she's no longer Hasidic. They belong to a conservative shul in Alexandria, right? But she has two brothers who are still Hasidic, and one of them eats turkey and one of them does not eat turkey. Okay, because the one believe it's not kosher because it's a new world bird and there can't possibly be a Masorah, right? But the OU accepted it kosher, and the fact of the matter is that the country that has the highest per capita consumption of turkey in the world is Israel, right? I mean, you go to Israel and you come home and you could, if turkeys could fly, you would be able to fly home from Israel without using El Al, right? Um, but you know, talk about mistaken beliefs, right? We all know Les Nessman thought turkeys could fly, but in fact they don't. Well, why a turkey? But anyway, right? So obviously, the overwhelming majority of Jews believe that turkey is kosher. Okay, but we also now know that this is based on a mistaken assumption about the nature of the turkey and where it's originally from. Right? So my question to you, and this is like a legitimate question, right? When you have an ancient custom, right, that we know is the result of a mistake or an error, right? What do we do with that? I mean, maybe we shouldn't eat turkey, right? Now, obviously, if you're a vegetarian, this is not an issue for you, right? If you don't keep kosher, presumably maybe not also an issue for you because you say kosher or not kosher, I don't care, I like it, right? But for those of us who eat meat and keep kosher, right? What should we do with the fact that the acceptance of turkey as a kosher bird is based on what I would say fake news, right? That is to say, based on, you know, either the mistaken assumption that the turkey is just a big chicken, or the mistaken assumption that the turkey comes from India and the Indian Jews had a tradition that it was kosher, right? Both of those are just flat out wrong, right? So the question is, what should the impact of that knowledge be? I mean, I just throw that out of the question. Right? I'm not suggesting that anybody actually stop eating turkey, right?
And it's in your family tradition, right?
But it's a wrong tradition.
But this, you could say there's a lot of traditions that may be wrong. Right? I mean, the fact that you started this whole earlier, but between Jacob and his two wives, right?
Right.
The tradition is not to marry two women, two sisters. But
Right.
so the question is, when do you accept the family tradition as something you should follow, whether it might have been right or wrong?
Right. That's exactly the question. I mean, and so you say, Lloyd, correctly, right? I mean, I presume that your family ate turkey, right?
Yes.
And and whatever. And you say, so I have a family tradition that, and and you also probably grew up more traditional than I did, right? You probably grew up keeping kosher, so it's relevant that your family ate turkey, your family kept kosher. You have a tradition, but we have lots of traditions, right? I mean, you also, because every one of us descends from a family that had a tradition not to count women in the minyan,
Right.
right? Every one of us descends from a family that had a tradition to treat gays and lesbians as if they were people who made disgusting choices and should be shunned from the community, right? But we don't follow those traditions because we say they're wrong, right? There are traditions, but they're wrong, so we don't follow them, right? Now, the difference, and I'll grant that it's not a minor difference, is that the tradition of excluding women was harmful. The tradition of discriminating against gays was harmful, right? The tradition of eating turkey is not harmful to anybody except maybe the turkey, right? Um, so that there is absolutely a difference, right? But to me, the question still remains: if we have a tradition and we now know that that tradition is somehow wrong, should we say it's a wrong tradition and should no longer be followed? Right? Yeah, Brian.
I think a lot has to do with your family minhag. Like, some people will lay tefillin on Hohomoed, but they won't. But other families won't. So I think even if it's wrong to lay tefillin on Hohomoed, but it's your family tradition, you still continue with that minhag, or vice versa. So I think so it might have to do with if it's been your family tradition, then it's your family tradition. Whether you find out later it's right or wrong, are you going to spurn your family's tradition because you found out that it wasn't the right thing to do? So that's
All
that's
right.
the
I
way I
mean,
think about it.
yeah, that's a very good point, right? That is a very, very good point. I mean, and by the way, I have no answer for this. I mean, I actually do have an answer for this, which I'll get to. Okay. But the difference is that we know now that the acceptance of turkey as a kosher bird is based on objectively counterfactual assumptions, right? In the same way that, you know, if your division of the government, right, looked at this building and said, it's a house, and assessed it on the basis of it being a house, but it's actually a factory, right? Can the owner say, well, you've been assessing it as a house for 10 years, right? Even though it's a mistake, you must continue assessing it as a house? And the government would say, no, we made a mistake. We know we made a mistake. It's actually a factory, right? Um, so there are counterfactual assumptions, right? A turkey is not a big chicken. A turkey doesn't come from India, right? These are just simply counterfactual assumptions, right? This building is not a house, it's a factory, right? Whereas the question of tefillin on Chol Hamoed, it's a dispute within the sources that goes back centuries, right? And there's not objectively a right or wrong answer, right? So as much as you say, if it's your family tradition and that's it, the family tradition about whether to put on tefillin on Chol Hamoed, although most Jews don't put on tefillin on Chol Hamoed or any other day, right? Um, but it's not based on like something that is like objectively verifiably wrong. Okay, so
Let
to
me, let
me
me,
that's different.
let me ask another question. If for some reason the OU people were to come out and say, well, we have a question that take your position and we don't know if turkey's kosher or not, and we're not going to give it in a hashgacha anymore, right? Suddenly you've been eating, and you keep kosher, you've been eating
Right.
treif for most of your life, and your
Right.
parents have been eating treif. Where do you fall into? You suddenly have, I'm suddenly, I really haven't kept kosher my whole life anymore. Am I?
Right.
Where
That is
do you go with that?
that is an excellent point, right? And some of the more recent responsa have said exactly that, right? The concept is lo lahotzi la'ag al harishoni. Okay, what are we going to say that our parents and grandparents and great grandparents were eating treif all these years, right? In other words, the custom has become widespread, and good and holy and pious Jews for centuries ate turkey, right? So who are we to say all of a sudden it's treif, right? I mean, you want to like act stringently and personally not eat turkey, right? So don't eat turkey. Gegas und hate, right? I mean, the turkeys will thank you, right? But the turkey farmers maybe not so much, right? But to suddenly come along and say that these righteous Jews were actually sinners is deeply problematic, right? And that to me, I think, and I'll wrap up with it. That to me is kind of the crux of the matter, right? Is that you can sort of on a historical or scientific basis, right, recognize that an error was made, right? But once that error has been made, it's now part of the tradition, right? Precisely because, again, I mean, there is a difference between customs or errors that are like really harmful to people and customs and errors that are not, right? I mean, and if, after 120, so you get up to Shemaim and God says, turkey actually is trace. Okay, I don't think God is going to punish you for following the traditions that, Klal Yisrael has inherited for, a few centuries, right? Um, but there are certain things that, as I say, have crept into our tradition that objectively might be erroneous, right? Like but nevertheless, they are now part of our tradition. And, to not follow them, particularly to say that previous generations were sinful, I think is also deeply problematic. So Lloyd, I agree 100% with your point and share it. And that's kind of for me the bottom line. I have more that I could say, but maybe not right now. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yes.
Yeah, Tom.
Rabbi, a big argumentative here. It's kind of interesting that we turn and say, oh, well, a mistake has been made back whenever, we need to fix it now. Oh, great. Can we review that arbitrary ruling that chicken became meat? No. It's customary. We've been following it. I go, but what about the, different part? But one other thing, if you go to your rabbi, what's happened? I go to my rabbi. Can I eat turkey? He ponders, he may ask others, and he goes, you can eat it. Later, it's turned out to be wrong. Now, the rabbi, as far as him sinning, he made a call in good judgment, but that's a different court. I'm covered in the fact that I went to the rabbi and said, can I have this with this? I've gone to the source. Now, as soon as we discover the rabbi says, oh, it's a mistake, I should probably stop. But isn't there
Correct.
a principle about, once the rabbi said, that's my ruling. And of course, if you make a ruling, it may change. You're not part of the Sanhedrin that I know of.
Well, we don't have a Sanhedrin, right? We don't have a Sanhedrin, but that's precisely the way the system works, right? If you have, I mean, and you know this because you come to me with kosher questions for the shul, right? And I say, yeah, Tom, we can use that, or no, we can't, right? And you follow it. And if I make a mistake, the mistake is on me, right? Having said that, I mean, I can't recall a situation, but I'm sure it could happen where I say to you, yeah, Tom, that's fine, right? And 6 months later, I receive new information and I tell you, remember when I said you could blah, blah, blah? That was wrong.
Yeah.
Right? You would stop doing it. The question then is, well, what do we do? Right? What do we do? In other words, I told you it's okay to use a certain product, right? I told you, I don't know. It's okay to use broccoli that doesn't have a texture, right? And 6 months later, I read this article about problems with broccoli, right? And so I say, Tom, no more bird's eye broccoli, right? No more bird's eye broccoli. The only brand of broccoli you can use is Bodek brand, at $10 a bag rather than the bird's eye $2 a bag.
Yeah.
Right. And you say, okay, fine. But what about the fact that 6 months ago I made broccoli kugel, right? Do I have to kosher the pans that I used for the broccoli kugel, right? What about right? There are questions to which there are answers, right? But what you couldn't do is say, well, 6 months ago you said it was fine, so I'm going to keep doing it. Right? I mean, not that you would, but yeah, it's possible that you know, we could make mistakes. There's no question about it.
Well, normally when I come to you, it's not what a ponderous thing. It's Rabbi. I know the answer to this question is in a 2-inch thick book on kosher that's in the kitchen, but I'm trying to get things cooked up. Hey, can I just tap you into? Do you know that one?
Right.
I think that's normally what I come to. It's not a we have cloned asparagus. I'm not cloning asparagus, by the way, under any circumstance.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
I happen to like asparagus. Anyway, so we'll wrap up and move on.
Yeah.
Move on to Musaf.
Actually.